So today this teaching is mainly for the ethnic Mongolians of the Russian Federation and also the White Russians. So you are the main receiver of this teaching this time. And then there are people who have come from different parts of the world. And then there are quite a number of Chinese also who have come for this teaching. And similarly, there are many Westerners who attend my teachings normally. No, no. So since many years, since a few years, there was the Russian Federation, people from the Russian Federation have started coming to my teachings. And last year I did Yamantaka initiation for the Russians. And then this time I thought of giving the Goya Samaja initiation. And next time, perhaps I would do the Chakrasambhara initiation. So today afternoon, I'll do the preliminary process of the Goya Samaja initiation, and tomorrow I'll do the actual initiation of Goya Samaja, within which there are those of the process of entering the mandala and then having entered the mandala, receiving the initiation. Within the initiation, there are basically 4 initiations. The first one, the first initiation is for maturation of the generation stage. And then the 3 later initiations are for the maturation of the completion stage practice. And for a practical purpose, it would be best good if we could visualize or practice and cultivate that of the generation practice, generation stage. And as a preliminary to that, we have to practice the common path of Buddha Dharma. And so after having gone through the common path, then you receive initiation, and then you go into the generation stage practice. And having developed experience, quite a degree of experience in the generation stage, as it was done in the past in India, then you should focus on a particular object, and such that you are able to focus on the deity or whatever, the visualization for about a fourth of a day. Then you should enter into the completion stage practice, using the channel's vital energies and so forth. And then within the completion stage, there are those of the isolation of body, speech, and mind. And within the isolation of body also, there are 2. So for us, of course, regarding these practices, the completion stage practice, we could only think of gaining some imprint. And for us now, we have to do the generation stage practice, and then receive, having developed quite a good experience of the generation stage, then you should go into the receiving that of the secret initiation And then the wisdom, go into the wisdom knowledge initiation. When you are able to get some experience of the meaning clear light. And so this is how we should ideally go about with the practice of Tantra and receiving the initiations. And for usually what we do is from the side of the students, they usually don't have much eagerness and to do the practice of Tantra seriously. It's just like you just take initiations like a custom, and then from the side of the lamas also, they also give the initiation with that kind of idea only. So I usually tell people that in Tibetan tradition we have a practice. So perhaps it's an exception for Tibet because of the widespread of Buddhism in the length and breadth of the land. So recently I've been telling people that we have to follow the Indian masters' traditions in approaching the teaching of the Buddha, which is to say that you have to you have to give teachings of the general teachings. They're giving you the complete structure of the teaching. And there is no danger of misunderstanding. Whereas there are certain teachings which are meant for particular specific disciples, where the disciples have a very special karmic impression from the past and are spiritually matured enough for certain techniques which are used by certain masters, and so which of course prove very profound and makes great difference for such individuals. So this kind of the second type of approach could sometimes cause confusion and mistake in people who have no understanding of the general approach of the procedure of the teaching. And so, just as the Indian masters have done, it's good to go about the teaching following the Indian masters' tradition of covering the general structure of the Dharma. And so as part of the common teaching, we'll do the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas. And then for the generation stage practice, maturation of the generation stage, then we can do the Vas initiation, whereas I will not do the 3 letter initiations this time. And because I'm doing the Vas initiation this time, I thought also of giving some teaching on the generation stage practice, how to actually practice it. And with regard to the text that I'm going to use for this teaching, of course, there are many different texts written by in Tibetan and by Tibetan masters, but I will first use Nagarjuna's Dorje. Of course, in the Tangyur collection, there are texts on Hevajra, Kalachakra, and so forth. And then in one of the volumes, the volume Ngi, is about Goya Samaja. So I have received teaching on this text of from Gyabjati Rinpoche, my junior tutor, late junior tutor. So I thought of giving you a short, brief teaching on the generation stage practice of Guhya Samaja. So this morning we'll have the teaching on 37 practices of Bodhisattvas, and then in the afternoon the preliminary to of the Guya Samaja, and then tomorrow morning I will do the initiation of vast initiation of Guya Samaja, and then a day after tomorrow we'll do have teaching. And so having received the teachings and the initiation, you have to meditate, do meditation, and practice the teachings. So while you work, also you should also do practice. So you have to do your best to meditate, and you could also do the retreat on Guya Samaja. So having done your practice of the generation stage, and you become quite familiar with the practices, and you feel that having done the vast and the profound generation stage practices, then we could perhaps have the latter initiations of the three-letter initiation of Guya Samaja afterwards. So this teaching is also going on being webcast. So the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas could be webcast, of course. And then we could also webcast the preliminary process of Guya Samaja initiation. But tomorrow, since we are going to do the actual initiation of Guya Samaja, so the actual initiation cannot be webcast. Although the preliminary process can be done, because according to the Tantra itself, it says the master has to first check whether the disciples are receptive to the teaching or not. So it's not going to be right to webcast the actual initiation, because there may not be the people who are not matured for that, and so it's not good. So until the point of entering the mandala, we'll webcast. Now, how is it going on, the simultaneous translation, Russian? How is it going on? Is it okay? Is it working for you? Okay. That's very good then. So first, the 37 practices. Before going through the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas, whenever I give some teaching on Buddhism, I give some introductory teaching. So with regard to that introduction, do you all, can you recite by heart the Heart Sutra? Does everybody know? Okay, let's then do the Heart Sutra. So they said the Heart Sutra is in Russian, so they're going to recite it. While they do the Russian, I'll read the English. Some of them don't seem to have the book. Does everybody have the book? The organizers have distributed? Okay. Okay, I prostrate the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time that Bhagavan was dwelling on mass of Vulture Mountain in Rajagriha together with the Griya. community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage trained who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and discrimination, compositional factors are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no order, no taste, no object of touch, no phenomenon. There is no eye elements, and so on, up to and including no mind element, no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. Therefore, there is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of the great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequal, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared that yatha gade gade paragade parasam gade bodhisva. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from the concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoiced. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadothiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding India entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, Asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan.
Затем Бхагаван вышел из того самадхи, вызвал одобрение Бодхисаттвы Махасаттвы Арья Авалокитешвары и сказал: прекрасный, благородный сын. Именно так, как тобой показано, так и практикует глубинную преждепараллель. Ты богатство рассказываешь. Когда идет Бхагаван такую речь, то достопочтеннейший Шарипутра, Бодхисаттва Махасаттва Арья Авалокитешвара, преисполненные всех достоинств окружения, а также боги, люди, асуры, дархары, все вместе возликовали и воздали хвалу Бхагавану Бхагавана. Закончена Махаянская сутра, называемая сердце Бхагавана Прajapati.
Perhaps it is the first time we recited this Heart Sutra in this temple in Russian. So generally, the meaning of Dharma or Chö in Tibetan, we can understand it to be religious faith, which started in this world around maybe 4,000 years ago. So in Egypt, it seems there were religious faiths in those times. And Indian civilization, this may have started around 2,000 to 3,000 years. So when people faced difficulties which they were not able to help themselves, then they found some kind of a relief by finding some thing that they can put their hope in and faith in. And so because of that, the religious faith came into being. Do you hear me? Everybody hears? Just going. So please test the Russian transmission. Okay. Please don't take the bread now. You can take it when tea comes. When you get tea, then you can take it with the tea.
Скоро будет чай, и с чаем хлеб будет вкуснее.
So around 4 or 5,000 years ago, the religious faith developed in the world when people faced difficulties in order to find some kind of relief from the difficulties. And then later, not only just religious faith, where you have some object which you keep your faith in was there, but some kind of a philosophical idea of what that object of refuge that looks like, or a description and so forth of that developed. In India, there was this Samkhya school which developed. Within that, there are those of the theistic and non-theistic Samkhya schools. The theistic Samkhya school believed in the creator God, whereas the non-theistic ones did not. And then the Jainism also doesn't believe in a creator God. Our suffering and pain and pleasure come about as a result of causes and conditions. So within the religious faiths, there are those of the theistic religions and then for example, the theistic Samkhya school within the Hinduism, and also those that believed in the Brahma, Shiva, and so forth. And then there are those of the Judaism, Christianity, Islam. So all these religions are theistic religions. Whereas in the non-theistic religious faith, there is Buddhism and Jainism, and plus those of the non-theistic Samkhya schools. So we have two different groups of religious faiths within those religious faiths which have some philosophical background. So since we have so many different religious faiths in the world, Buddha also mentioned in Lankavatara Sutra the three different vehicles, which are called the vehicles of the gods and humans, vehicles of the Brahma, and vehicles of Shravakas and Shravakas. So it is said that so long as there is discursive thoughts occurring in our minds, there are going to be many different vehicles. The human and godly vehicles refer to those religious faiths where the ethical morality is taught, how to live a good life, ethical life, so that one could be reborn in heaven in the next life. Whereas if you go against the commands or the teachings of the revelation of the gods, then you will be reborn into hell realm and so forth, such is taught. So these teach basically how to cultivate or experience pleasure, happiness in this human life, and then how one could be reborn in the heavenly realms. And then the Brahma vehicle refers to talks about the desire realm, where you enjoy the five sensual objects, and also not only that, you find dissatisfaction in the external sensual objects, and try to find happiness or bliss from within the mind by withdrawing or restraining your mind from getting distracted into the external sensual objects, but instead developing concentration, and then through that practice you try to get rebirth in the Brahma realms. So those are called the Brahma vehicles. And then within the non-Buddhist traditions, there are those of development of or the cultivation of concentration, single-pointed concentration, through which one can take oneself in the next rebirth into the form realm and formless realms. So these also come under this category of the Brahma vehicle. And then within Buddhism, we have those of the vehicles of Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattva Yana. So through these paths, one leads oneself out of samsara, complete out of samsara, and achieve that of liberation. So it is said that the root of our suffering is that of grasping at some independent self. And for that, you have, it is said that your faith alone cannot lead you or overcome this grasping at self. But you have to cultivate wisdom. Except Buddhism, the other religious traditions, all of them believe in some kind of a independent self, a soul or Atman theory, which is said to be separate or different from the body and mind, and which is unchanging as well, and permanent. So what Buddhism calls such a soul is permanent, autonomous, and a single self. So in English, this is, the term that is used is soul, and in Sanskrit, the term Atman is used. So such a theory of soul or Atman believes in is said to be said to believe in a self, which is like a master of the one's body and mind, whereas the body and mind are the its possessions. So this in this theory, this soul or Atman is said to be not dominated by that of the body and mind, but it dominates the body and mind, and it's said to be unchanging, permanent. And so this soul or Atman is said to be single, permanent, and autonomous. Whereas in Buddhism, such a soul is not there, and grasping onto such a self or a soul, an Atman, is the root of our suffering. So if you meditate on if you meditate on selflessness, then you'll be able to overcome this grasping and overcome suffering. So this is how we go about in Buddhism in regard to practice. Wow. Blessing for you. Bye-bye. Oh, 오간다. 가서 도서. So some of you have come here very early in the morning. So did you get? Perhaps you may not have got breakfast. Did you? So if you have not got it, then this tea and bread is going to be very good for you. In 1979, when I was in Moscow, the first time in Moscow. Jamyang was there. The hotel where I stayed was a restaurant. Hotel was a government hotel, so they don't serve breakfast until 8 o'clock. So I felt very hungry at that time. Amen. So the teaching of selflessness in Buddhism, a teaching which is related with the selflessness, a theory of selflessness, is a teaching of Buddha, which doesn't accept Creator God, nor some kind of the root of samsara as being some kind of a universal factor, saying that everything else is a manifestation of this universal factor, which is said to be also permanent. So things are not believed to be have arisen from permanent cause, nor without any causes, like a creator, but things come about as a result of its causes and conditions. Even with regard to the external world, it has arisen through causes and conditions, and then the internal world of sentient beings also have come about through their causes and conditions. The external world is something inanimate. So when we talk about this external world arising from its causes and conditions, the cause mainly refers to the substantial cause, the building block or the main material that gives rise to it, whereas the conditions can be many. So all these things that we see around us, this hall, the different things that we see around it, are all made up of the building blocks or units or atoms, and the atoms get together, and then we have different aspects or different things that arise. And so if we trace this origin of all these particles, the science talks about Big Bang. So from that time onwards, from the Big Bang onwards, then we have the subtlest particles or the units that make up these external worlds. So even the Big Bang happened because of explosion, which is because of some energy getting very dense, and then and then this explosion also has happened because of its own causes and conditions. And then these causes and conditions themselves have their own causes and conditions, which have to be something material. So we can go back to the causes and conditions of those particles as well. And so Buddhism says if you trace back the origin of causes and conditions of those particles, you cannot find the first cause as such. And so it's infinite, the beginningless. And so this is how we can understand the external world have come about, whereas the internal world of sentient beings have some kind of experience, feeling, or sensations within themselves. So this experience of feeling and sensation is part of mind or consciousness, which experiences some object and becomes aware of objects as well. So whether it's the external objective conditions or the internal world of experience, which take on the aspect of the objects, it is this thing which is within us, the internal world, which takes on the aspect of objects, is called consciousness. So someone who has this experience of consciousness is called a sentient being, a living being. And this sentient being has this consciousness which is aware of objects and experience them. And so this in itself also changes the consciousness. We can tell from our own experience in daily life experience that consciousness, our mind changes. For example, the sensory perceptions also change, and then the mental consciousness, which is brought up about by these sensorial perceptions, also change. So it is a fact that we know for ourselves that the consciousness changes. And this is because of causes and conditions, because it's dependent on causes and conditions. And therefore, in Buddhism, it is taught that all composed objects are impermanent. So, with regard to impermanence, also, there are two different levels. One is that of a gross form of, for example, if we look at the trees, we can see the trees dying out or becoming dry and so forth. This gross form of impermanence happens because of certain subtler change that is happening. For example, within a year, the change that happens in the tree happens in 1 year, and this 1 year is made up of 12 months. And so each month there has to happen some change in the things. And each month is, within each month there are weeks, and each week the changes happen, and each week being made up of days. Each day there must be some change, and within each day we have hours and minutes and seconds, and so every second things can change. Without going through some change within during each second, you cannot talk about a change having happened within a minute and hour and so forth. So because there is change happening, these changes happening every second, so without which you cannot have the change in the gross form. So in these days we talk about changes happening in nanoseconds. So this momentary change that is happening in things is said to be the impermanent nature of things. So this is what we refer to when we say things are impermanent, this momentary change. So why this momentary change happens? The gross changes happen because of course, some lacking some factors, some conditions. For example, a flower can die out because of lack of oxygen or because of lack of some other conditions. So things that grow and then die out in a year, within them, because of lack of certain conditions, gross changes happen. But the momentary change that happens in things is not because some external condition is met for its cessation, but the fact that it is brought about by its own cause leads it to change. And it disintegrates momentarily. So long as something is dependent on its causes and conditions, it must be momentarily changing. So momentary change is how we define impermanence. It's a definition of impermanence. So the consciousness changing, the fact that consciousness changes every moment is because of its causes and conditions. And the causes and conditions themselves also have their own causes and conditions. It's just as the external world doesn't have a beginning to its causes and conditions, so similarly the consciousness, the internal world, cannot have a beginning, and it's a continuum. Because if there is a beginning, then you would have to point to a material thing for the consciousness, whereas this cannot be possible. So in Buddhism, it is considered very important to analyze things. The natural change or impermanence that is happening in things are not because of the Buddha's blessing and so forth. And within the teaching, there are those of the four principles of functionality of things, relativity of things, and then you have the evidence, the principle of evidence, and things happen through its causes and conditions, and then because of these causes and conditions, it has its own functions. They have their own functions, and so that is about the functionality, the principle of function. And then the principle of relativity shows the dependence of things. And then there is the nature, the principle of nature of things. So the fact that consciousness has to arise or come about as a result of its causes and conditions is nature. And the fact that the consciousness is some kind of experience is also nature. So it's the fact that there is external world is also nature. The elements of fire, water, and the space and so forth also are nature. And so the things that are happening in the external world and internal world of sentient beings are because of its causes and conditions. So if consciousness were to be brought about by something which is not a consciousness, then you would have the beginning to it. So since this is not possible, you have to trace the continuity of the consciousness based on previous moments of consciousness. And based on this understanding of the continuity of consciousness coming from some previous moments of consciousness, we posit or we talk about the past life. In many of the Indian religious traditions, they talk about rebirth, reincarnation, and also Buddhism talks about it. So whether it's external world of material things or internal world of sentient beings or consciousness, they have to have their own continuity, previous moments. So we also have certain experiences, those of the blissful or pleasurable, unpleasurable, and neutral. So even animals have these. So why these different experiences happen? The fact that these are in the nature of the consciousness is because of previous moment of consciousness, which is to say its nature. Whereas the fact that we have these three types of feelings or sensations experience, pleasurable, unpleasurable, and neutral, which are different effects that arise from their causes and conditions. So their causes and conditions have to be posited on the basis of the consciousness itself. Mainly, so what cause these pleasurable, unpleasurable, and neutral feelings is, if we go to the cause, their causes, at the causal level, so if we have done something which makes others happy, benefit others, like the thought of wishing others to be happy, then such an attitude gives rise, as its result, some pleasurable feeling. And then also with that kind of intention, if you have done something, some action which benefits others, and then these give rise to pleasurable experiences within yourself. And then on the basis of the continuity of the consciousness, if your intention was to harm others, and then do some action accordingly, then that gives rise to some unbrushable feeling within your continuum of consciousness. And so such intentions give rise to verbal and physical actions of harming others, talking, using harsh language to others. And so these give rise to, so these are called actions, karma. So karma means action. So when you talk about an action, you have to have an actor. So it has to be done by an actor. The neutral feelings give rise to an effect which is also neutral, which is neither good or bad. So on the basis of the experience that we create within ourselves, we have the experiences, the resultant stage of pleasurable and impressionable and so forth. And then on the basis of that, we have the So generally, there is the law of cause and effect, which is not so much related. I mean, not necessarily related with some experience, the mind. But when you talk about karma, then it has to be related to one's own motivation, through which one creates an action. So suffering is has neither come from some permanent cause, such as a creator, nor it has come from some unconducive cause. So why that has happened is because of some cause and conditions which correspond to these experiences. And so these experience of suffering has come from, according to Buddhism, from the origin of suffering. So you cannot just make the suffering go away just like that, but by avoiding the causes which give rise to it. So first of all, you have to restrain yourself from creating the causes of the suffering, and then eliminate the cause. If you want happiness, you have to create the causes which correspond to that result. And so Buddhism is talking about the law of causality. Do you understand something? Okay, that's good. So Buddha taught this noble truth of suffering, and then the truth of this origin of suffering. And then after these two, then he taught the truth of cessation and the truth of the path. So we have to really give serious thoughts to these two. So with regard to the origin, there is the karma and the motivation which gives rise to such, which is within which there are those of the destructive emotions. So of course, within karma that we create, there may be karmas which are not intentionally done, but somehow you have created them. But basically, when we talk about karma, we have to have some kind of a motivation. And this motivation may not happen just naturally. So why they happen is because of the three poisons that we have. So we try to harm our enemies because of dislike, some kind of animosity towards them. And that also happens because of self-attachment, and also attachment to one's own near and dear ones and one's possessions, wealth, and so forth. And when you find someone who happens to be someone who harms these, the things that you are attached to, then you become angry. So because of the self-attachment and also attachment through that attachment to one's near and dear ones and the possessions, you experience hatred towards others. So this hatred basically happens because of this attachment, doesn't it? So if you go to a market and see some fruit sellers, look at a fruit seller's shop and see the fruits, and if you see someone running towards the shop and then hit one of the box and then they topple the boxes, the fruits, you won't feel that bad. But once you buy some fruits yourself, then you think this is my fruits. And once you have that attachment, then you see someone hitting these fruits, and it drops on the ground. Then you feel some it readily attracts your attention, and you think my fruit has been thrown on the ground. Whereas previously, when it was in the shop, it was not yours, and someone throws it on the ground, then you don't feel so bad about it. And so once it becomes your fruits, then when someone throws it on the ground, then you feel anger towards the person. So this anger is because of this attachment to oneself, and that also the attachment and anger also happens because of this notion of an I that you have. So if someone's very always thinking of oneself all the time, people cannot even play with them. Whereas if someone is not so attached to oneself, then even if other people play with them or provoke them, the person will not get angry easily. So when you have a very strong attachment or grasping at yourself, then you have naturally you have this attachment to yourself, and then hatred or anger towards others. And so Buddha says the suffering is rooted in our attachment and anger, and these in turn are rooted in this grasping at itself. So, of course, we have this grasping at a self, at yourself. And so, if you check what this self looks like, which you are attached so much, if you check it, then you'll find that it's neither the body nor the mind. We have the five aggregates, and this I, or the self, appears as if it's the master of these five aggregates, doesn't it? When you say, I'm a Russian, you're not only thinking about the body, nor only the mind, but you are thinking there's something different from these two, the body and the mind, which governs, which rules over it. Is there something that you feel? When you feel some discomfort in your body, then you say, I'm sick. And then you say, my mind, my body. And when you think like that, this I or the self appears as if it's like a master of the body and the mind. So the other religious traditions believe in such an self being truly existing, whereas in Buddhism there is no such a self. Just as we grasp at an independently existing self, there is no such a self in Buddhism. So when you think about this self, so we create causes, actions which create actions which harm others. So this also happens because of ignorance, which is misknowledge. So whereas there is no such a self which is independently existing, this ignorance holds on to that kind of. So it is an exaggerated form of grasping. So it's a distorted notion. So ignorance is a distorted perception. Of course, ignorance is very broad. Just merely not knowing something is also ignorance. But when we are talking about the cause, the root cause of our attachment and suffering and so forth, then this is that kind of ignorance which holds on to a self, independent existing self, which is not actually there. So Buddha says there is no such self-sufficiently existing self. And when you understand there is no such a self, then this grasping or clinging on to a self, it kind of loosens. And when you are able to see or become familiar with the notion that there is no such independently, sufficiently independent self, and you will not have this attachment towards oneself, and then through that you will also not create or have hatred or anger towards others, which it help reduce anger, attachment. And so out of the three poisons of hate, anger, greed, or attachment and ignorance, the root of the other two, the first two, is that of ignorance. So this ignorance is not something which accords with the reality of how things actually are. It is just an exaggerated form of perception. So this is something which goes against the wisdom or the understanding which accords with the reality. So this grasping at a independent or self-sufficient or self is diametrically opposed to the understanding which sees that there is no such independently or existing self. So these two go diametrically opposites. So this grasping at a self, independent self, doesn't happen all the time. Whenever we have consciousness manifestly in us, we do not necessarily have this grasping at a self-sufficient, the existing self. So when you are So there are times when this self, grasping at a self-sufficient self is not there. So there are occasions when you are able to see the selflessness of such an self. So what this shows is that it's not necessary to have this this misnotion whenever you have a consciousness. When we become very angry, we are full of hate. So there are times when we become really hateful of others, and at other times, there are times when you feel very strongly compassionate and loving towards others. So if our mind itself is in the nature of anger or hatred, then whenever our mind arises, a thought arises, there has to be anger or hatred. But this doesn't happen. So apart from this hatred or anger, we also can develop love, affection towards others, which goes against this hate or anger. So hatred, when we have hatred, then we reject others. We feel disgustion towards others, whereas when we love others, then we kind of embrace them. So these two go diametrically opposite. So we can have these two different experiences separately. So this shows that the mind and the basic mind in itself is not in that the nature of hatred or anger. So the hatred is not an intrinsic nature of the mind itself. So you can have the antidote or which goes against it as well. So therefore, it is said that this ignorance, it is possible that we can eliminate this ignorance. Because by cultivating the understanding of selflessness and familiarizing our mind with selflessness, we can do away with the ignorance. So this ignorance has a very powerful antidote against it. And this also, the antidote has a support of valid cognition, and whereas ignorance doesn't have that support. So ignorance cannot become more and more powerful because of lacking the valid support. Whereas this understanding of selflessness has a valid support, and therefore the more you acquaint with it, the greater and stronger it will become. So suffering comes from, it's the origin of suffering, which is those of the comes from hatred and attachment, anger and attachment, which in turn are rooted in ignorance. And this ignorance is something which we can, it is said that it is something which we can get rid of. And because we are able to get to the root of the suffering and get rid of it completely, therefore there is liberation. And therefore, the third noble truth, which is the truth of suffering, truth of cessation. Cessation here doesn't mean something becomes inexistent as such, but what is there, the conditions which give rise to the suffering is put to an end. And that happens because of a certain factor which puts end to it, which is the antidote to the cause of suffering. So that is called the path, the true path, which leads one to that of the cessation. And therefore, the Buddha taught these four truths: the truth of suffering, truth of origin, cessation, and path. And so this shows that we can the Buddha says that we can attain this a total elimination of the suffering and its causes, and attain that of liberation. So the suffering comes from this the grasping at the self, and this can be eliminated or gotten rid of through the path, and thereby whereby we can attain that of the cessation, which is the total pacification of all the suffering. And so what keeps us from attaining this cessation is that of this grasping at the self. And once you get rid of this self grasping, then you attain that of the liberation. So in some non-Buddhist traditions, they talk about primal factor, which manifests all the different things in the world. And they say that once someone is able to see that everything around them is a manifestation of that primal factor, then only the conscious self is left, and that is called liberation. They term that as a moksha. And similarly, in Jainism, they talk about moksha in terms with regard when they talk about moksha, they refer to some kind of an abode that they reach. So although moksha or liberation is taught in the non-Buddhist traditions, the liberation or nirvana that we are talking about in Buddhism is the total elimination of self-grasping at a self, which comes about through the antidote, the understanding of selflessness. So it's different from the human and godly vehicles, and also the vehicle of the Brahma and so forth. Injine chugu Israel, ti jablone, magi jablone chugu Israel. Now. No. So this wisdom realizing, cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness is something which is the path that leads us to the cessation. So although this cultivation of the wisdom is the same, but because of certain other more extensive and vast factors that are used, we have those of the three vehicles, those of the Shravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and the Bodhisattva yanas. And so within Buddhism, we have those of the Thailand, Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia, and so forth. They have the Pali tradition of Buddhism. So the Pali tradition Buddhism was taught publicly by the Buddha. So perhaps the language that was used was Prakriti, or the common people's language. And then the teaching when the teachings were put together, compiled later, they were compiled in using this language of Pali. So we have the Pali tradition of Buddhism, whereas for certain disciples of pure karma, then Buddha gave certain other teachings. So with regard to beings with pure karma, for example, in the Heart Sutra, we find mention of the Buddha sitting in meditation, sitting absorbed in meditation on the concentration called the profound perception, and then through the inspiration of the Buddha, the Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara engaged in dialogue. And then at the end, we find mention of the Buddha coming out of the meditation and then praising Avalokiteshvara. It is like that. It's like that. So we find mention of Avalokiteshvara in the Heart Sutra. Of course, Avalokiteshvara was not somebody who was accessible to everybody. It's like that. And so he must have been accessible to some very specific disciples at that time. And then there were other people and beings in the entourage. And then there are also other mentions of Manjushri, Bodhisattva Manjushri, and Maitreya, and so forth. In one of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, it mentions these other bodhisattvas being in the retinue of the Buddha when he taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And so it's very clear that there were pure beings with pure karma who were there. So because the Mahayana teachings were not taught publicly, there were people who said that Mahayana was not the teaching of the Buddha. And therefore, later on, Master Nagarjuna has argued that Mahayana is actually teaching of the Buddha. And similarly, in the Sutra Alamkara of Maitreya, perhaps in the second chapter, which is the chapter arguing that Mahayana is teaching of the Buddha. So Maitreya also argues for Mahayana being is teaching of the Buddha. And similarly, one of the disciples of Nagarjuna, Bhava Viveka, in his Tarkajvala, Blaze of Wisdom, argues very forcefully that Mahayana is the teaching of the Buddha. And similarly, in the wisdom chapter of the Bodhisattvacharya Avatara, there is such an argument. So these masters were not just people who said things without making any critical judgment or analysis. And they were not people who just resorted to what was popularly being said around during their times, saying that, oh, my father has said so, or such and such person has said so. They were not such people who just follow some kind of hearsay. So these masters were very intelligent, brilliant teachers. They even critically analyze the teaching of the Buddha himself and make this distinction between the provisional teachings and the definitive teachings. And so similarly, Bhavaviveka, in his Lamp of Wisdom, uses logical reasonings to conclude certain points. So these masters were not just following hearsay, but they were logicians, great logicians as well. in The Blaze of Wisdom by Bhava Viveka, Bhava Viveka even criticizes the masters Asanga and Vasubandhu. If he were just follower of if he were just someone who followed on faith, then he would not make criticism. So he even mentions that the Asanga and Vasubandhu were shameless people. So this shows how critical he was in using logic and reasoning. So in Sutra, it says that the bhikshus and wise people, you should not, you should check my teaching, just as a goldsmith checks gold by cutting, rubbing, and scorching. And so you should not take my teaching on devotion alone, thinking that I'm your teacher. So Buddha himself says that his disciples should not take his teaching just because it's his words, but they have to examine them and then experiment. And once through the analysis and experiment, when they find something very effective and in accord with reasoning, then they should follow it. So this is something different from this approach is something different from other Buddhist faith traditions, where the followers have to base themselves on faith alone and not an examination of the teachings. Whereas Buddha says his disciples must check his teachings. With regard to the Sandhi Nimochana Sutra, the sutra of unraveling the thought of the Buddha, there is mention of certain teachings being that certain teachings cannot be taken literally, but they have to be interpreted otherwise, and they are called interpretable or provisional teachings. And so when certain teachings don't accord with reasoning and they are against reasoning, then you have to interpret it otherwise. So although these are they may be teachings of the Buddha, the provisional teachings like those of the Sandhi Nimochana Sutra cannot be taken literally, but you have to understand these teachings otherwise. So you have to differentiate between the thought of the Buddha and the subject matter or the content of the scriptures themselves as well. So within the sutras, you have to differentiate between the interpretable or provisional and the definitive teachings. And then within the definitive teachings also, you cannot rely on the words, but the meaning. And then within the meaning, you have to rely on those of the, not on the superficial understanding or awareness, but the true awareness, deeper awareness. So these masters have checked the teachings and then applied the teachings within themselves and found them to be in accord with reasoning and experience, and then said that such and such teachings were provisional teachings, and then others are definitive. So what Master Nagarjuna and these other masters have said to be the provisional teachings and then definitive teachings, we can also, if we check carefully these teachings of the Buddha, we can also find them to be true. Whereas the interpretation according to the Chittamatra tradition, we can sometimes find faults within the interpretation of the Chittamatra masters of certain teachings being provisional or definitive. So if we only resort if on the Pali sutras, then the understanding of selflessness may not be complete. So within, for example, within the interdependency of things, we have the two levels, which is the causality, interdependence in terms of causality, and then the interdependence in terms of designation. And the first one is, of course, found in the Pali tradition, whereas the second one we may not find mentioned in detail in the Pali tradition. So if we don't have Mahayana teaching, then it would be very difficult to logically prove the Four Noble Truths, particularly that of the truth of cessation. In Pramana Vartika of Dharmakirti, he logically proves the four truths. So if you were to say that the Mahayana teachings are not the words of the Buddha, then the real, the gist of this, the teaching of the Buddha may be lost. So the teaching of selflessness or emptiness that is taught in the Mahayana scriptures is based on, basically this is taught also in the Pali tradition, where they talk about selflessness. So the Buddha first gave the sermon on the Four Noble Truths, and laying the foundation of the practice of Buddhism, to lead the followers to that of the liberation. And then with regard to the this truth of cessation, which is attained through the path, you have to understand, have developed or cultivate the understanding of selflessness in a profound way. And this is done in the Mahayana tradition. And then what is referred to as the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma, according to the Samdhinimorjana Sutra, within which is included that of the Tathagatagarbha Sutra. So this one, this sutra, demonstrates and establishes that of the fact that things are not intrinsically existent in a great detail in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra. So also the Tathagatagarbha Sutra goes on to mention that of the clear light nature of mind. And this teaches both of the clear light in terms of the object and the clear light in terms of the subjective mind. And then when you go deeper into this clear light or the subjective mind, you go into the Tantra, which goes into great detail about this clear light. And Gongda Rinpoche says that if you have to climb a high mountain pass, you cannot first level the ground down there and at the foot of the hill and jump up to the top, but you have to climb steadily upwards and then reach the top. So similarly, you first have to go through the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, and then the teachings of the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the perfection of wisdoms, and then the teachings on the clear light nature of the mind, and then the Tantra, especially the highest yoga Tantra, which talks about the innate, subtle clear light, and which is the basis for attaining that of the omniscient mind of a Buddha. So this is true. So there were people who said Mahayana was not a word of the Buddha, and in the past, and even today, we have people saying so. So we have to know how these great masters that I've mentioned have proved or argued for Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha. So Kalmykias, you follow the same Buddhist tradition as Tibetans. So you have of course you have total devotion to Buddha and total faith in the Buddha, and then of course you may have faith in the Buddha's teaching, but then the complete teaching of the Buddha, including Tantra. And then when you meet some professor, a Westerner professor, and who says that this teaching, the Tantra and these teachings are not, the Mahayana is not teaching of the Buddha, of course, you would have something to argue to them. If you don't know how to argue, then you will not have anything to say. So in the past, I have also met some Western professor who said that the Buddha didn't know Sanskrit. So when you meet such people who say Mahayana is teaching the Buddha, and if you have the knowledge and the reasoning to say that Mahayana is actually the teaching of the Buddha, then you would say, of course, there were such people in the past, even today there are such people, so that's not a big deal. And then in Tantra we find mention of the different subtleties of the consciousness, and of course there are mentions of subtleties of the mind even in the Sutrayana when we talk about those of the concentration RAM and so forth. So if you don't know that the difference between these two different ways of explaining the subtleties of the minds, you won't be able to make difference. So we recently had a Mind Life conference in Delhi, and with scientists, and then also with some Indian religious faiths. So if you are able to know the subtleties, the degrees of subtleties of consciousness that are explained in Tantra, then you won't confuse other explanations of the subtleties of consciousness in other traditions with these. So even in non-Buddhist tradition, Hinduism, so they also have the tantric practice of using the channels and chakras and drops, subtle drops, and also they have the practice of the projection and transference of consciousness. But then the difference between the Buddhist Tantra and non-Buddhist Tantra is that in Buddhism we meditate on deities, visualize deities and so forth, based on the understanding or the wisdom of selflessness. And so on the basis of this wisdom then you arise or generate yourself into a deity. So basically, that deity is the arise from this wisdom. So this is the difference. Otherwise, you will not. If you don't understand it, then it will not make difference. One time I was in Chile, in the hotel where I was staying. They had hung some tankas of various deities, and then the deities. The painters have also drawn the chakras on the bodies of these, and during the recent meeting with some non-Buddhist traditions masters, they also talk about the three channels and the six chakras and so forth. So when I saw those tankas in Chile, then I wondered whether they were Buddhist deities or non-Buddhist deities. So I was quite doubtful whether those tankas were Buddhist tankas, because they may have hung the tankas thinking that I was maybe thinking that they were Buddhist tankas or something like that. So just because there's the explanation and description of mandalas and the explanation of chakras, bindus, and channels doesn't make a tantra, a Buddhist tantra. So you have to have this understanding of selflessness. So Master Nagarjuna himself has written tantric texts. And particularly, he has written texts explaining the Guhya Samaja Tantra. So some people say that, some scholars say that, of course, there were two Nagarjunas. One who wrote the philosophical texts such as Mula Madhyamaka Avatara and so forth. And then there was also a Nagarjuna who was a Tantric Nagarjuna. So I met some scholars who say that the masters such as Aryadeva who wrote tantric texts was not the same Aryadeva who wrote the 400 verses, and then similarly the Chandrakirti who wrote tantric texts was not the same Chandrakirti who wrote the Madhyamaka text. But one time I knew a great Sanskrit scholar, an Indian master, Upadhyaya. He had done some research on the Vimala Prabha of Kalachakra. And during his research, it seems there was some Sanskrit texts, original Sanskrit texts of Vimala Prabha left in some Nepalese library. And during one of his visit there, he found a piece, one single folio on which is written Sanskrit. And when he read that, he said that the style of writing was the same as Aryadeva, who wrote the 400 verses. So he looked at the details of the style of the writing. So he told me that he could conclusively say that text was written by the Aryadeva, who wrote the 400 verses. So perhaps that was the Charya Mila Bhaka or something like that, which was written by Aryadeva. We have this text in Tanjore in the Tibetan translation. So when he found that single folio, he was able to conclusively decide that that was written by Aryadeva. And therefore, Upadhyaya told me that he was confident that Aryadeva actually wrote a tantric text. And then I also heard from some Sanskrit scholars who said that the style of writing of the Prasanapada and Prasanapada, and then also that of the Dönsel, the clear lamp or bright lamp, they were written by the same master, Chandrakirti. I didn't have detailed discussions with them, but they said that. So Master Nagarjuna has written text on Tantra, and such as the 5 stages. And then Aryadeva has written a commentary on that. So Tibetan masters also do not just say, just because certain text is said to be written by this and that master, they believe so. They also, lots of analysis were done. So because it is said that in Tanjore we find certain texts is said to be written by Master Nagarjuna, but when some Tibetan masters checked them, they find that this was not written by actually Nagarjuna himself, because if it was written by Nagarjuna, then this text should have been quoted by Nagarbodhi, and which is not done in Nagarbodhi's text, and therefore there is some ground of doubt of that being written by Nagarjuna. So there is another text where it is said that that it was written by Nagarjuna, but when you read the text, you find that the text actually quotes lines from Aryadeva, who was, of course, a disciple of the Nagarjuna. So it's not possible that something that Nagarjuna himself wrote is supported. For that, he uses the support of his own disciple. So when we talk about the teaching of the Buddha, you have to, just as we say, the source of water or origin of water has to be the snow mountains. So when you have such authentic teachings, and then you have the followers who have commented on, then by thoroughly analyzing and then establishing them, and then the followers of these masters such as Nagarjuna, who have actually applied those teachings and experienced them, then such teachings could be considered authentic, unmistaken, but teaching of the Buddha. So with as part of this introduction to Buddhism, we have within Mahayana there are those of the perfection vehicle and then the Tantrayana or Vajrayana. And within Tantrayana, we tradition when the Buddhism came to Tibet, we have the old translation tradition and new translation traditions. So these new and old translation traditions were made on the basis of Tantra. So whereas the sutra teachings are all common to all the Buddhist traditions of Tibet, whereas when it comes to Tantra, then there are some differences. And because of these differences that arose, then we have the Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, Geluk. So these different traditions, the difference comes from on the basis of Tantra. So we use the term Sangha Sarma and Sangha Nyingma, which is to say the old translation school of Tantra and new translation school of Tantra. So we have these different Buddhist traditions of Tibet. This is Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and then the Kadamba tradition. Which leads a disciple through the three teachings of the three types of beings based on the teaching of the Buddha. And then add on that's the Tantra. So all these traditions are for the same in terms of following the Nalanda tradition. So Lama Tsongkhapa himself emphasizes mainly on the Guya Samaja, for which he has 4 volumes of text written on Guya Samaja. So out of all the different tantras, he emphasized mainly on Guya Samaja Tantra. And out of all his different tantric practices, his main practice was Guya Samaja, perhaps. And therefore, when Rinpoche Tsongkhapa, in terms of upholding the tradition of his tantric tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, then we have the Gyudu and Gyume tantric colleges. So after having given some teaching of Tantra, at the end, when Lama Tsongkhapa asked who is able to actually uphold this Tantra, showing the text of Guya Samaja, and nobody amongst his disciples was able to get up. But Jiten Sherab Singye rose up and said, "I will uphold it." And then Rinpoche said that was very good, and that's how the Tantric College came up. So in Tibet, in the central part of Tibet, we have the upper and lower Tantric colleges, and then in Tsang region we had the sort of Segyu tradition. And so these Tantric colleges were even called Sangdu Tasang, which is to say the monastery of Guya Samaja Tantra. So of course, Guya Samaja is there in other traditions, but it was mainly emphasized by Tsongkhapa. So his own commentaries had their sources in Nagarjuna's Dorje, Dose, and then with regard to the initiation, he finds his source in Nagabodhi's text. So there is portraits of Master Nagarjuna and Master Nagarbodhi, which I have hung up here on the wall. So I found this in in a monastery in Japan when I once visited there. When I first saw it, I thought these were masters, Japanese masters. So both of these masters were depicted holding vajra each in their hands. And then I asked who they were, and they said these were Nagarjuna and Nagabodhi. So they were both holding. They are both holding vajra. Whereas in Tibetan depiction of Nagarjuna, we usually don't have Nagarjuna holding a vajra, but on his head we usually draw the snake hoods. So we usually say that Nagarjuna brought the Panchaparamita Sutras from the Naga lands, land of the Nagas. So I usually joke that the hoods of snakes were drawn on top of his head because Nagarjuna doesn't have a hat, and therefore he needs to protect his head from mosquitoes. So that's why the hoods are there. So when I saw this painting of Nagarjuna, and I asked where they got it from, the people in the monastery said that they got it from another monastery which had this painting of Nagarjuna 700 years ago or something like that. And so, of course, in Japan, they don't have the highest yoga tantra practice as such, but they do have the yoga tantra practice, which is within which there's the Vajradadishwari practice. And so in the lineage master of this Vajradadishwari practice, they have Nagarjuna as one of the lineage masters, and therefore they got it from that other monastery. And so I asked whether I could get a copy of these paintings of Nagarjuna and Nagabodhi. So these two masters were main principal masters of the lineage of this Goya Samaja as well. So Master Nagarjuna himself has written texts such as Dose, which is commentary on the Guhya Samaja Tantra, and also the 5 stages of Guhya Samaja. So because this is an authentic source which is in the Tenjur collection, I thought it would be good to teach the Doje by Nagarjuna. So Guhya means secret, and then Samaja means community. So with regard to how to comment on the Samaja Tantra, there are said to be 6 doors and 4 ways of commenting on it. And then there are other texts of Guhya Samaja, such as Jnana Vajra Samachaya and so forth, which are contained the authentic teachings of the Vajradhara himself. So Master Tsongkhapa says that by understanding the Gwe Samaja, one is able to actually untie the knots of the teachings of other tantras and the entire scripture of the Buddha. Personally, I find that what is mentioned in Gwe Samaja as the three empty states after the dissolution of the 80 conceptions, I find it helpful from the Nyingma tradition of where they comment or explain the Rigpa. And so So when you become familiar with these teachings of the Nyingma tradition, such as the which comment on the three concentrations and so forth, and then you find real benefit of these teachings to understand the Gwe Samaja and so forth. There is a saying that so long as the Gwe Samaja teaching is extant, there is the teaching of the Buddha. Whereas once the Gwe Samaja becomes extinct, then the teaching of the Buddha also ceases. So it's very important to have this Gwe Samaja. So this is the introduction to Buddhism. So please take out the text, these 37 practices of Bodhisattvas. I don't know which text you have. Oh, don't come up, please. You're squeezing me. So in order to practice the Vajrayana, or the secret mantrayana, if you have, you could do it authentically if you have the understanding or the view of emptiness, without which there's no basis for doing the tantric practice. So within the understanding of the emptiness, ideally you should have the Madhyamaka view of emptiness, the understanding of emptiness. If not, then you should at least have the understanding of emptiness according to the mind-only's philosophical school. So the great masters of India so when it comes to conjoining the bliss and emptiness, there were texts which were written according to the Chittamatra philosophy. But if you have this view of the Chittamatra, is it possible to overcome the two obscurations, the cognitive obscuration and the destructive emotions? It's not possible, it said. So I saw one writing of Panchen Paldeneshie where it says, so in the Dzogchen teaching, everything, the samsara and nirvana, is the expression of the wisdom awareness. So if you're able to get a very good grasp of this uh, understanding of the Rigpa, then you will be able to understand the subtle interdependency of things, that the things are merely imputed. So Bajabaldin Rishi also says that when someone who has reached the isolation of mind, even if the prior to that the practitioner may have been a Chittamatra philosopher, at that point the practitioner actually gains insight into the emptiness that is taught in the Madhyamaka philosophy. So, so when the person is able to see from his own or his or her own experience that of the clear light, the meaning clear light, the subtlest clear light, then there's no way that the person can actually hold on to the Chittamatra philosophical thought, but when they must enter into the view of Madhyamaka. And usually when we do tantric yoga practice, of course, we say everything turns into emptiness, and from within emptiness things arise, this and that. But we just do it while we are distracted here and there. That's not going to lead us nowhere. So if you're able to really meditate on emptiness as best as you can, as well as you can, and then from within that meditation, if you think of arising into a deity, then it would make some difference. So if you were to do, if you wish to do good tantric practice, then there's this understanding of emptiness is indispensable. And only meditating on emptiness will not lead you into real tantric practice, but it has to be complemented by bodhicitta. Because when Joche Adisha was in Tibet, he heard a news from a visitor who came from Tibet and asked what news was there. News was there in India these days, and this visitor said, one Hevajra tantric practitioner had actually attained the stream enterer level. So this is because of lack of bodhicitta, the practice of bodhicitta within his tantric practice. So although the practitioner may have the realization of emptiness, but because this was not complemented by bodhicitta, he actually entered into the stream entry level of the Hinayana path. So in order for this wisdom realizing emptiness to become antidote to that of the obscuration to knowledge, then it has to be complemented by bodhicitta. So without which you cannot do tantric practice. So in order to have bodhicitta, you have to cultivate compassion, the great compassion. So of course we have some ordinary kind of compassion, such as compassion towards one's own near and dear ones when they are in difficulty. So this is something which is based on a biological. So this comes from a biological factor, such as a mother's affection towards her child, and the child's affection towards his or her mother. And even animals have such biological compassion. So, so long as someone has to survive based or dependent on relying on one's mother, there would be such an affection. But this is something partial. So here what we are talking about is infinite love and compassion, which is unbiased, impartial, so which actually takes all sentient beings as an object of compassion, and particularly you should where you should have infinite compassion towards your own enemy or adversary. Whereas we usually have affection towards some near and dear ones, when they have difficulties, when they have suffering, we feel that compassion towards them, mainly because they are they are the ones who are good to you, who are nice to you, and help you, and so forth, and therefore you respond in this way. Whereas someone who harms you is called an enemy. Instead of having compassion towards such person, you feel animosity towards them. And then to people who are neutral, you feel indifferent. So you have to get rid of this indifference and the partiality. You should not think just because that other person is helping you or are nice to you and so forth, you should feel compassion. That's not the reason. Whether they are near and dear ones or neutral to you or your enemy, they all want happiness and not suffering. And everyone also has the same potential to overcome their suffering and attain happiness. And therefore, you should feel a special concern when you see them rather suffering. So just like yourself, they also want happiness and not suffering. Then you can have impartial compassion towards everyone, whether they are near dear ones or enemies or neutral. It doesn't make difference. So you should develop such an unbiased or impartial compassion. The biological compassion that you have has to be used as the seed, and then using our intelligence. We as humans have this very special intelligence. Using our intelligence and reason, we have to develop this limited compassion and expand it further and make it infinite compassion, unbiased compassion to all suffering sentient beings. So if you put effort, you will be able to develop such an unbiased compassion. I can tell from the small experience I have. So to have such an unbiased compassion, you should have two different factors. So the suffering beings, whether they are your near and dear ones or people who are far from you, you should make that difference. And then what this happiness that we experience is dependent on other sentient beings. As I said earlier, this comes, the suffering that we experience comes from a self-grasping attitude, and then which in turn gives rise to attachment and anger. And so all happiness in the world comes from wishing others to be happy, and all suffering in the world comes from wishing oneself to be happy, as Shantideva says in the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. So cherishing others is the source or the foundation of all excellences, whether temporary or long-term. And all the misfortunes that we face comes from this self-cherishing attitude. So you cannot point to this source of suffering outside, but you have to point it within yourself. And if you think carefully, you'll find this self-centeredness, extreme self-centeredness, and then the grasping at self are the roots of all our misfortunes and the suffering. And then if you also think carefully about the cherishing others as being the root or the cause of all excellences or whether in this life, such as our food, shelter, clothing, fame, um, furnitures and so forth, facilities that we have, friends and so forth, come and depending on others. So the higher rebirth in the next life also comes in dependence on, in relation to other sentient beings, because when you abstain from or creating the seven bodily and physical actions, negative actions, as well as the three mental negative actions, then you create causes for higher rebirth. So this, in turn, has to be practiced in relation to other sentient beings. Therefore, higher rebirth in the next life also is dependent on other sentient beings, and also our liberation also comes about in dependence on other sentient beings, because we have to practice the three trainings of morality, concentration, and wisdom, which have to be done in relation to other sentient beings. So even at the level of our, at the basis level, or we development of our spiritual attainments also have to come, and independence of the sentient beings, and finally the resultant Buddhahood also comes from, and the liberation comes from dependence and through the dependence on other sentient beings. So that is the main reason why we have to generate compassion towards other sentient beings, because all our excellences, everything good that happens to us is dependent on other sentient beings. And then we also talk about suffering, which in Buddhism, when we talk about suffering, we're mainly thinking about the third type of suffering, which is the conditioned existential pervasive suffering. So when Buddha says we have to understand suffering, know the suffering, he's mainly pointing to this samsaric suffering, which is the pervasive existential suffering. And it's not pointing only to those of the suffering of suffering and changeable suffering. So we are more or less attached to the pleasures of this life because of not being able to understand what suffering actually is. So Buddha has said that so long as we are under the power of this kind of suffering, the third type of suffering, we will have the rest of the suffering as well. And so this is the main focus when we try to think of overcoming suffering. And then when we think about overcoming this kind of suffering, this comes about as a result of our ignorance, which is the root of the origin of suffering. So when you want to understand what suffering is, rather than thinking about suffering that other people, other sentient beings experience, you have to think about the suffering of yourself. This the karmic psychophysical aggregate that we have is the nature of suffering. So we can think about the suffering that we have and develop this wish to go out of such a state of suffering. So be feeling discontented with this kind of suffering you can that you have within yourself, and developing this wish to go out of suffering, taking yourself as the basis, you cannot actually think of other people suffering, and therefore you have to develop this renunciation. And in order to develop renunciation, in order to feel compassion towards others, you have to have renunciation. In order for that, you have to avert this clinging or towards the pleasures of this life, and the clinging to the pleasures of the next life. So in order to reach Buddhahood, you have to have bodhicitta within yourself. And in order to have bodhicitta, you can't just pray, may I experience bodhicitta, but you actually have to develop compassion. And compassion in turn is rooted or dependent on that of renunciation, the thought of renunciation, wishing to go out of samsara. So this is how you go about with the entire structure of the Buddhism. So of course, if you are someone who is really ready to mature spiritually, having done practices in the past life, a Lama can, of course, give us a specific practice, and then you can focus on that. So in the case of King Udayana, who was given this painting of the Bhava Chakra, the 12 links of dependent origination, just by seeing and being introduced to the cycle of existence through these 12 links, he was able to readily become matured, spiritually matured, and realized. So for such special individuals, I mean, such things can happen with a very short, pithy teaching. But for the general practitioners, we have to follow the general approach to the teaching. These terms were used by Nyengun Songrup, one recent Tibetan master. Now we are going to go through the 37 practices. The first verse of salutation. So someone who wishes to practice bodhicitta, this text shows how one should go about in daily life in one's practice. So because Chandrazik, Avalokiteshvara, is the deity for compassion, for someone who wishes to cultivate bodhicitta, he is the deity for that. The first the line shows that of the ultimate nature of things, and then the second line shows that of the conventional nature of things. Nagarjuna says all Buddhas give their teachings based on the two truths. And in the first noble truth, the teaching on both the truths are given, and then when Buddha went into more detail emphasizing on the ultimate truth, he gave the second taught the second turning of the wheel, Dharma. So the two, Nagarjuna says, the two truths are those of the ultimate and the conventional truth. So the meaning of emptiness is to be that of independent origination. So by gaining a certitude in the appearance nature, which is that of the dependent origination, then you have to go into that of the ultimate nature. So in order to get into the ultimate nature, ultimate truth, you have to depend on the conventions. So ultimate truth or emptiness, when you talk about emptiness, it doesn't mean nihilism, but that there's nothing, but that things are dependently arisen. So it says, you who see all phenomena neither come nor go. Doesn't here neither coming and no going doesn't mean that there's no going and no coming as such, but because you Kalmykians have come from Kalmykia and now you will go back to your country. And here, having come here, you are staying in hotels, and You have come from your hotel to this place, and you're going, and in the evening you'll go back to your hotel, and so it's not saying that there's no coming and no going. Even cattle, they go to the mountains to graze and then come back to their habitat in the evening. So there is the action of going and coming. There is the actor also who go and come, and then there is a place where this action is acted upon. So although there is coming and going, the action, actor, and so forth, but they exist when you do not make any analysis of them. But when you do analysis, you cannot find what is coming and what is going, the action of going, the actor, and the place acted upon. So you cannot have some action without the actor, nor the place acted upon, nor the actor without the action and the acted upon, and so forth. If you try to find each of them, you will not find anything, because they are all dependent on other factors. So you will not find them without being dependent on others. So in terms of the true nature of things, then the way things actually exist, then when you try to find action of going and coming and so forth, action of going from one life to another, the goer or the sentient beings and so forth, you will not actually find them in the ultimate sense. But they do exist conventionally, and therefore it says still you strive or you work to serve solely the sentient beings. So conventionally there is coming and going, it shows. And so then the next two lines. So with regard to Buddhahood, it is not something like creator, which is expounded in the other religious traditions, the theistic religions. When you ask what God is, it is something inexpressible. So, as opposed to that, when we talk about Buddhahood, then a Buddha comes about through practice of the path, and having overcome the two obscurations from within their mind stream. And so there is a path which leads to that Buddhahood. So it says the perfect Buddhas, the source of benefit and happiness, arise from practicing the genuine Dharma, which is the method which purifies the two obscurations from within one's mind. And by practicing the Dharma, someone becomes a Buddha. So this factor, the method for purifying one's negativities from within one's mind, has to be applied. And by applying that, you slowly are able to get rid of the grosser forms of defilements. And then, just as when you wash clothes, a dirty cloth, first you use soap, which will get rid of some dirt, the gross dirt, and then you go wash it further and further, and finally all dirt will go away. So similarly, in the case of mind, the defilements are overcome gradually. And therefore, you have the practice of restraining from negative actions first. So because in Buddhism, the objective is to fight against or combat the defilements. And so first of all, you try to restrain yourself from committing, restrain yourself from the negative actions. And then you try to overcome those of the defilements of clinging or grasping a true existence, and then finally you try to overcome or completely get rid of the imprints left by those by this clinging to true existence. So, with regard to bodhisattva practice, you have to as part of the bodhisattva practice, you have to refrain from the selfish attitudes, and then develop that of the bodhicitta within yourself, and then engage in the six perfections of bodhisattvas. And therefore, you have to know all these different practices of bodhisattvas. And so it says, so here I'll explain the bodhisattva practices. Next verse. So in order to do bodhisattva practice on a daily basis, you have to know what you're going to practice. Without knowing that, so, for example, if you want to live your life by becoming an economist or a lawyer or a doctor, in order to become a professional, these professionals in these fields, you have to study the different subjects and apply them and become expert, and then you can make your living as doctors and so forth. So similarly, in order to practice the bodhisattva, in order to do bodhisattva practices, you have to first know what to practice, and in order for that, you have to listen or hear the teachings. And therefore, with regard to the practices that you are going to apply, you first have to develop this wisdom arising from hearing the teachings or by reading scripture. So through these, you will have some idea of what to practice. So this is understanding arisen from study or listening. And then it says reflecting, which is referring to the wisdom arising from reflection. So after having studied or heard the teachings, then you have to give thought over and over again. And sometimes we may use scriptural quotations and try to find which source you are taking, where it has come from. And then you also have to understand whether such those quotations can be taken literally, or you have to interpret it otherwise. And then you also have to, first of all, you have to find the teaching. And through finding certitude in the teaching, you have to find certitude in the teacher. As it is said by Tsongkhapa, by understanding the teaching, may I find certitude in the Buddha, in the teacher. So otherwise, if you're not sure, you may hear if you just stay at the level of hearing the teaching, then when someone says something else, you will say, you will just doubt about what you have thought it may be. If you have given thought to it and used reasoning and gained certitude, then you'll be, when someone adds something else or otherwise than what you have concluded, you'll be able to reason to them and say, this is not like what you say, but it is like this, because of such and such reasoning. So having gained certitude, it's not enough to stay there as well. What you have to do is try to develop experience of the teaching. So within this experience, you can have the experience of using some state of mind and getting used to that experience, whereas in certain meditation, you take on the aspect of an object and try to familiarize your mind with that aspect of the object. So, having gained certitude in the teachings, then you should develop that experience through familiarization within your mind. So, having familiarized yourself with that object of meditation, then you will have some sort of an experience where you say, "Oh, now maybe I will be able to have a real experience." And then you will further push yourself, and the experience arises. The actual experience arises if you put effort. Whereas when you don't put effort, it will not arise. So you'll develop to such a degree. But then, when you push further in your practice, you will have effortless experience, where just as you give thought to the meditation that you want to do, this experience arises immediately. And so, this is a very high level of experience or practice of concentration as well. Next verse, which talks about abandoning homeland, being a practice of bodhisattva. So in order for one's study or listening and reflection and meditation of the practice to be very effective, you have to live in solitude. So otherwise you are distracted here and there by day-to-day living. You are rather overcome by unleisurely experiences. So in Jingmi Gyewe Nyoku's Dzogchen guided teachings, there's mention of finding no leisure to do practice because of the different distractions that we have. Sometimes, of course, we can find excuse saying that I don't find time to practice, to meditate. And of course, sometimes I say that I do not have the time to cultivate shamatha. So those of you who have time, you cannot find excuse saying that you don't have the time to practice. So you should be away from the social distractions in order to practice. So if you have lots of people around you whom you to distract you, such as near and dear ones, you have to look after, or those of the enemies you have to overcome, then there's no way you can actually do practice. So many Kalmukyas were shifted from their own land, and so into Siberia, and of course, once they were in Siberia, they didn't have much to do. So you have abandoned land. So similarly, Tibetans have become exiles, so we have also abandoned our own homeland. So regarding the abandonment of or forsaking the distractions, social distractions, or homelands, there are two things. So, although you may be away from your homeland, you should not have lots of distractions towards processions and things like that. Otherwise, even if you may be away from your homeland and family and so forth, but when you are in the monastic room, if you have lots of things that you have gathered, then you will have lots of distractions as well. So this shows that of seeking solitude. So for beginners, practitioners, it's very important also to physically seek solitude away from other people, such as doing retreat and meditation without having much interaction with other people. Sometimes it could also be it is also good to restrain from talking with other people much. So you can practice silence. So I had teachers who used to do half days, practice silence half day, which is very good because when you talk with others, you get distracted and then you lose lots of time when you talk. So this shows that this human life that we have found is very powerful one. That it's showing that we have to use it productively. So the fact that we are not able to do Dharma practice effectively is because of the notion of permanence, that we will live for long, and then because of that, we try to gain lots of wealth or look after our near and dear ones and so forth. So we have to meditate on impermanence nature of our life. So this next verse is taught for that, which is talking about to let go of this life is the practice of bodhisattva. So as I said earlier, the gross form of impermanence, such as this life coming to an end, is something which is inevitable, which we cannot avert. Where there's a beginning, there's an end. That's for sure. And so, where there is birth, there is death. And so, the death is uncertain. We may go to a doctor, and the doctor may diagnose us and say that we are healthy, there's no sickness, no disease, and so forth physically. But then death can still come to us unawares. When you die, your wealth cannot help. Even if you may have lots of millions or tens of millions of money in bank, it will not help. Even if you may have a palace to live in, when you die, that doesn't help. And also your near and dear ones, very good family members or friends. When you die, you would be eternally separated from them. So they cannot be of help. So your wealth cannot help, your near and dear ones cannot help. Even this body that you have will not help you. And then you gasp for breath, and then your breath will stop because of certain internal and external conditions. The elements in the body also become imbalanced, and then your breath becomes harder and harder, more and more difficult. And just like at the end, when the breath stops, like the breaking of the string of a guitar, At that point, and your flow of blood to the brain also stops, and then the brain stops working. And then, according to tantric texts, uh, after the breath stops and the heart stops and the brain dies, and then the four emptinesses seem to happen. First emptiness, number 1, 2, 3, and 4 seems to happen. When people who have some experience of meditation, we can find that their body remains very fresh even after their clinical death. Whether these four emptinesses happen rather gradually, or they stay in that the fourth level of clear light. The scientists, even today, the scientists are doing some research on this, but they have not found any conclusion yet. So, in Buddhism, we have this mention of staying in the clear light. So, this teaches how to avert that of the notion of permanence of oneself. And then the next verse shows, in order to have a very meaningful life, you have to be very self-disciplined. If you go only according to your friends and near and dear ones, then it's very difficult. So, for communist countries, it's when you were under the communist regime, it was the life was very difficult. But you have now you are free from the communist regime as such. And in Tibet also people have great difficulty. So when you have the freedom, you have to use it productively. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult. So if you have friends and families near and dear ones who only are think about money, then you would also become like them. And also, if you have some alcoholic person next to you, first you will smell, you find the smell of the alcohol rather disgusting, but then having been with a person too long, you will find the smell rather pleasing, and then you will perhaps take 1 or 2 sips or drops of the alcohol, and then you get addicted to alcohol, and then you become alcoholic in the end. So whether you become a good person or a bad person also is dependent on your friends. In Buddhism, we talk about evil friends. So they are the ones who lead you to the unrestrained behaviors, and which are done under the power of the 3 poisons. And the next verse shows to cherish spiritual friends more than your own body is the practice of bodhisattva. So this is talking about your virtuous friends, someone who was a condition for you to enhance your own virtues. So if you have friends who are virtuous all the time, then you will also be able to emulate them slowly, and you will even if you may be in the beginning a bad person, then you will also become a good person in the end because of such influence from a good friends. So amongst the good friends, someone who leads you through the meditation, the practices of turning your mind to virtue systematically. Uh, you have to have spiritual teachers. And if you can go only on faith, then of course you may not need such spiritual teachers. So you don't only look for a spiritual virtuous friend, but a spiritual teacher who can lead you through virtuous practices systematically to. So when in reliance on someone your negativity is diminished and your positive qualities grow like a waxing moon, to cherish such a spiritual friend more than your own body is the practice of a bodhisattva. Says, Buddha is our spiritual teacher who showed us the path, who has showed us the path. Master Nagarjuna also was a teacher for us. So you will not be able to reach that goal of enlightenment just by praying to them, by just wishing it. Buddha himself has also said that I have shown you the path to nirvana, liberation, but liberation itself is in your hands. So there is no way the Buddha can actually make us liberated just by being there, but by showing us the path. And so whether you reach that liberation or not is dependent on you. If you don't practice the teaching, you will not. So teachings that of the Buddha is not like his subjects like history or geography or economics and so forth, where the teachers can just introduce us to what the subjects, the different topics and so forth. But here we have to have a spiritual teacher who has to be able to transform ourselves. In order for death to happen, the teacher himself or herself must be transformed, must be someone who have been able to tame their own unruly mind. And so it's not enough to be as knowledgeable about Dharma. Of course, the teacher has to be knowledgeable about the teachings as it's taught in the scriptures, and also must be someone who is experienced. And so this teacher must be knowledgeable as well as experienced. So knowledgeable in the sense of understanding the three collections of teachings of the Buddha, and experience in terms of having the experience of the three trainings. So if you have a teacher who knows the teachings but doesn't have any experience, doesn't practice it, then this person cannot be your spiritual teacher. So Je Rinpoche has said, until you have, there's no way you can actually tame others if you're not yourself tamed. Therefore, he says, so for someone who wishes to tame others, first of all, one has to tame oneself. So it's not enough to have someone who is effective in terms of by doing some practice, some puja for yourself, or who is accurate in his more divination, but someone who is knowledgeable in the three scriptures and the three collections of scriptures and experienced in the three trainings. In Lamrim Chemo of Tsongkhapa, before he quotes these lines of And so, before quoting from Maitreya's in the Sutra Alamkara, Lama Tsongkhapa says that a teacher, a spiritual teacher here, must be someone who can actually lead the disciples through the teaching of the Buddha, according to the general approach. And for that, the person must be someone who has experience in the three trainings, and therefore the three things such as subduing, pacified, and then totally pacified attributes are taught. And then the teacher also must be more knowledgeable than the disciple, and must have be tireless in helping the disciples, in putting effort, and have compassion. And so, because we are in Buddhism is talking about that of reaching liberation, which must be attained through understanding of selflessness, one must have the understanding of emptiness, and therefore the teacher also has to be skillful in giving the teaching. The teacher cannot be someone who is boastful about his knowledge or have some kind of a competitive feeling towards others. Otherwise, the teaching, the Dharma, will not turn out to be Dharma, but a source for negative actions. And also the teacher has to be compassionate towards the disciples. And then when you go into Tantra, the disciple has the teacher must be qualified in the sense of having the 10 suchnesses, external and 10 internal suchnesses. So right from the Vinaya up to the Tantra, in Vinaya where you talk about the preceptor, up to the highest Yoga Tantra where you talk about the Tantric initiations, the master cannot be just someone who can give teaching, but you have to check whether how he or she is giving the teaching, whether the teachings are in accord with the Dharma, according to the scriptures. And in the scriptures, it's also said that the disciples must check the teacher for 12 years before taking the initiation. The disciples have to check the teacher whether he or she is qualified or not to become a tantric teacher for oneself. So it's not sufficient to have the name of a teacher, but one must have qualified teachers. So first you have to find a qualified teacher, and then rely on him or her, regarding him or her as your own spiritual teacher. So until you consider him or her as your spiritual teacher, you can relate to the person as a spiritual friend, a Dharma friend. So you can ask questions, and once you don't need in the beginning to consider the person as your teacher, but relate to him as friend and ask questions. And once you have taken the person to be your spiritual teacher, then you have to relate to the person accordingly. Relate to the person correctly as his or her disciple. Next shows seeking refuge in the three jewels is the practice of Bodhisattva. So this shows the principle of taking refuge in the three jewels. So with regard to abstaining from the 10 non-virtuous actions, the human and non-human and godly vehicles, as well as the Brahma vehicle, are all for this. This practice is common to all of these. So even in terms of our constitution law of a nation, if you commit these non-virtuous actions of body and speech, there are 7 actions of body and speech. If you kill somebody, it's against law. If you steal others' possessions, also you will go to it's against law and so forth. And so similarly, amongst the different religions, all these 10 non-virtuous actions are taught. So with regard to the covetousness, malicious thought and wrong view, they also can be understood according to the different traditions. For example, in Christianity, they talk about the covetousness as the cardinal sin. So these 10 non-virtuous actions actually are something which is common to all the religious traditions. So as Buddhist practitioner, your practice of Buddhism has to be complemented by that of taking refuge in the Dharma. Buddha as the teacher of refuge. As I said earlier, Buddha is somebody who has practiced or cultivated the wisdom of emptiness complemented by bodhicitta and overcome the 2 obscurations and attained the omniscience. And then the Dharma is the Dharma as the actual refuge, and which comprise of the true path and true cessation, and then the Sangha as assistants on the path, who have the experience of the Dharma, the truth of cessation and the path. So the Sangha. So when you do the 10 positive actions, abstaining from the non-virtuous actions, based on the taking refuge in the 3 jewels, then your practice becomes Buddhist practice. Otherwise, if you just without this taking refuge in the 3 jewels, you can have Christianity where the followers can have total faith in the Creator God, and similarly Islam. And so you have to have faith in your own religion, but you can respect other religions. So for example, myself, I have faith in the teaching of the Buddha based on reason. And so reasoned faith, but I have respect to all religious faiths. So even the Buddha himself sometimes gives teachings whereby he sort of indicates that there is some kind of a self. When he says the 5 aggregates are the loads, and the load is carried by the self or the person. But although it's against logic, but then because certain teachings are helpful to certain followers of the Buddha himself, he gave such teachings. And similarly, we have other Buddhist, religious traditions such as Christianity, which is really helpful to so many people. For example, In terms of education, there is no religious faith which has done greater service to humanity in terms of education than Christianity, whether it's in Asia or Africa or in other poor countries, Latin America. Christianity has done the most in terms of giving education to the people. This is something which has not been able to be done by Buddhists or Muslims and so forth. So basically, the Christians who help others do them based on their own faith in God, as service to God. So here I'm explaining Buddhism, and therefore I have to I talk about the greatness of Buddhism being greater than other traditions. But it doesn't mean that I don't have respect other religious traditions. So in Christianity, they say there's only one way to God, which is Christianity itself, and no other religious traditions can lead to that. So this is from the point of view of Christianity themselves, Christianity itself. So some Christians have said that, some people have told me that some Christians say that I come to the different countries and lead so many people to hell by giving Buddhist teachings. So I usually say that it's the people should not hastily kind of convert themselves to Buddhism. It's good to stay within their own religious traditions. So this kind of criticism that some Christians make towards me may have some grounds if people just hastily kind of jump to Buddhism. So if Christians were to come to Buddhist lands, countries where Buddhism is prevalent, and say that Christianity is the only way, we will not feel comfortable also. So it's the same with them. So with regard to the practice of taking refuge, the text says, themselves captives in prison of samsara, who can the worldly gods protect? So even in Kalmukya or Bharatya, you may have people who consider the local spirits and deities to be very sacred or holy. But this also happens in the Tibetan community as well as people in the Himalayan regions in India. So people are afraid of these spirits and local deities, and therefore they consider them to be sacred. It's not out of any real knowledge about them being great or anything like that, but out of fear, because these local deities can cause harm to them. Whereas we don't really fear the Buddha, do we? So if you practice the Dharma sincerely, take refuge in the three jewels sincerely, then these spirits and local deities cannot harm us. And then, particularly if you practice compassion, cultivate compassion and bodhicitta, this cannot harm you. Otherwise, we usually tend to consider the Buddha rather less sacred than these local deities and spirits. In our monasteries, temples, we find very wrathful protectors and consider them to be more important than the Buddha himself. So we should be able to consider the Buddha higher than anyone else. And you can take those protectors and so forth to be manifestations of to carry out the
enlightened activity of the Buddhas. So the Gyalpo Shugden, practice of Shugden has become quite prevalent in Tibetan community, in the Gelug and Sakya traditions. But I initially did practice of Shugden, but then later on I analyzed further and found the fifth Dalai Lama saying that the Shugden was someone who is a perfidious spirit who harm the Dharma and sentient beings. So this fifth Dalai Lama has not said this without doing any kind of analysis and examination, but with lots of critical analysis. He said this about Shugden. Then many other Gelug masters have also objected to Shugden practice. And so did I stop doing practice on Shugden. And I have asked other people to stop doing practice of Shugden. And so it seems there are in Buryat and Kalmykia, and especially in Mongolia, there are people who are doing practice of Shugden. So if you follow the Gelug tradition, you need Damjen Chogyal, who is the protector of the Gelug tradition. So until you hear that about the death of this Gelug protector, Damjen Chogyal, you don't need any other protected deity. And then there's a second protected deity, which is Mahakala, 600 Mahakala. So in order to really understand the three jewels, you have to understand the Dharma jewel. And by understanding the Dharma, you'll be able to find the possibility of attaining the cessation and the true path within oneself. And those who have attained such true path and cessation, they are called Sangha. And after having become a Sangha, then by further engaging the practices, finally one becomes a Buddha. So and then the next verse about the abstaining from the 10 non-virtuous actions. So we'll stop here.